Hi, everyone. Today, I wanted to bring up a quote I recently came across in an article on a popular Christian website. I'm going to read it and then we'll talk about it a little bit. It goes like this. When you think about it, the entire New Testament tells the story of a nation, the Israelites, who believes that they completely understand the scriptures, who God is, and what he requires of them. When a prophet, who turns out to be God himself, shows up on the scene to tell them otherwise, they kill him, having complete and utter confidence that they're correct in their theology and practice. So during this last fall and winter, I published a series of articles I called Consistently Wise. Okay, and this series of articles was about church decision making. Okay, and how the processes that we go through and the principles that we use to make decisions as churches. The material in that series was largely based on what I learned from a book called The Wisdom of Crowds. Now, that book, it's not a Christian book, but there are deep insights into group dynamics, right, and how humans function best together that I simply applied to church life. One article in particular, I talked about three phenomenons that actually make churches less wise. And one of those was called groupthink. And that's really what this quote in this article is talking about. This whole article is talking about this concept of groupthink. And in the article, the writer basically talks about how it's common in groups of people for the majority to think they're always right? Majority rule. We live in a democracy. So how should we make decisions? Well, let's just see what the majority thinks and go with that. And ultimately, the issue with this kind of operation is that it leads really to two outcomes. One being wrong more than you need to be, right? This leads the group to being inconsistently wise instead of consistently wise. And then number two, you alienate the minority that has a different perspective, right? And it leads to division, loneliness, and all sorts of other problems in a church. So it really may be hard to find a more eye-opening example of this than that quote I just read, right? Where the Jews and the Pharisees thought that they had God figured out, right? And they knew what he was like and what he asked of them. In order for people to avoid these situations, okay, they really must avoid being a group that simply reverberates the same positions and the same ideas over and over again. And that can happen to groups of people, right? Over time, they just think the same way and no one challenges that and they don't consider possibilities, right? New possibilities. And really what needs to happen in groups is they have to embrace perspectives, embrace possibilities. They have to draw them out, listen to them, and consider. And you may end up at the same point you would have anyways, but at least you have the confidence that you went through a bunch of possibilities, considered different perspectives, and still came out on the other side. It gives you more confidence. So the author of the article goes on to say this: if we learned anything from the Gospels, it's that in a blind world, the person with sight is thought to be insane. So there's an online group that I'm a part of that was discussing this concept, and a friend of mine in the group, his name's Richard Jacobson, wrote the book on churching, gave an eye-opening testimony really about avoiding this subtle trap of groupthink, and both in the business world and as a pastor of a church, because he was in both contexts and exercised these principles. So he says this concept influenced the way I ran my own team at Apple. I have the stats to prove our particular team was more effective than all the others at our specific location. You see, every quarter, all employees were given anonymous surveys which let them rate their satisfaction with the company, our location, each department, each member of leadership. Due to a number of rapid changes that happened across the company, we went from having one of the highest rated locations to one of the very lowest. Most of the leadership was unable to adapt to the challenges which were being asked of us. Naturally, my team was just as affected as any other, but because I communicated with my department and we relied on my team to come up with the best solutions possible, given the limitations we had to work with, there wasn't this us versus them mentality between myself and my staff. So while the other teams' scores tanked, mine was continually a 95 to 100 in terms of employee satisfaction. We often got straight 100s from customers, unlike other departments. In fact, it was only our department's score which bolstered the overall score enough to keep our location from being the very worst in the company. He goes on to say this: yes, it was a lot more work for me to run my department this way, and decisions often took longer, but the results spoke for themselves. The funny part is this. Now let's translate that into the Christian world, right? He says, the funny part is this: when I was a pastor in a church, this isn't how I did things. So only a handful of my volunteers flourished in my department, meaning the ones who were a natural fit the way I did things, while some others really struggled. He says he had a leadership title of pastor, but I wasn't really a very good leader in those days. It was actually when I started working at Apple that I think I began to operate like a real pastor. So I think that's a great testimony, right, of the experience of being both in the business world and in a church, and just what healthy group dynamics are, no matter where you are, how humans were really designed to operate, right? So I personally have come to believe that group dynamics and how they work in the kingdom is one of the most important aspects you can learn to grow as a Christian. How you relate to people, how you relate to the people in your church, how you relate to groups. After all, God's purpose for creating was the church, right? And that's a group. So that is, I believe, one of the most important things you can learn.